Guns made America a force, but diplomacy made it a superpower. It turned enemies into friends, helped them become prosperous, rebuild entire continents, and played the long game so masterfully that almost everyone wanted to join its side. But now something has changed. In the first weeks of 2026, America launched a midnight raid that captured a president, threatened to take an island from a close ally, and watched old friends talk about the end of NATO. So what happens when that art is forgotten? America is about to learn the hardest lesson of all. In today's world, real strength isn't when everyone fears you. It's when everyone wants you as an ally. Let's go back to when America still knew how to play the game. Europe, 1947. Cities were entirely destroyed, millions were starving. The continent that once ruled the world was on its knees. Europe had torn itself apart in two devastating world wars. The easy thing for the US would have been to turn away and focus on itself. But America chose a different path. George Marshall, the US Secretary of State, came with an incredible plan. $13 billion in aid to help rebuild Western Europe. This wasn't just cash, it was food, fuel, raw materials, and cutting-edge machinery sent to 16 nations, including old enemies like West Germany and Italy. Europe needed to buy equipment and food from the US to rebuild, but they had no US dollars to pay for them. The Marshall Plan solved this by giving European governments grant money to buy American goods. This kept the flow of trade moving when it otherwise would have frozen. When the US sent things like grain or tractors, the European governments sold those goods to their people. The money they collected went into a special fund, which was then reinvested, under US guidance, into rebuilding bombed-out railroads, power plants, and steel mills. American experts also traveled to Europe to teach new ways of working like assembly line production and improved farming techniques. This wasn't just about fixing what was broken, it was about creating a modern, efficient economy. George Marshall, the author of the program, said, "Our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos." But behind this humanitarian message was a cold calculation meant to strengthen the United States in multiple ways. The most important goal of the Marshall Plan was to stop communism from spreading westward. At the time, the Soviet Union wanted to replace capitalist governments with communist ones. Hungry and desperate people in countries like France and Italy were starting to support communist parties. By improving living standards, the Marshall Plan helped stop communism from gaining ground. The US economy also benefited from the Marshall Plan. American factories needed customers to sell to. By rebuilding Europe, America was basically investing in its own future markets. The Marshall Plan started a golden age in Western Europe. Countries like West Germany experienced an economic miracle, becoming one of the richest nations on earth. The US insisted that European nations sit down together and decide collectively how the money should be spent. This forced age-old enemies to coordinate their economies. This cooperation laid the groundwork for the European Union and helped ensure peace between old rivals like France and Germany. The Marshall Plan was the moment the United States acted as a wise global power. And in the decades that followed, America reaped huge benefits from having strong, grateful allies. Now let's fast forward 25 years to the era of President Richard Nixon and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. By 1971, the United States and China had been bitter enemies for over 2 decades. They had fought against each other in the Korean War and were on opposite sides in Vietnam. The idea of the US and China working together seemed impossible. But things were shifting. China and the Soviet Union, once close communist allies, had become fierce rivals, even fighting border clashes. Henry Kissinger, the US Secretary of State, saw a unique opportunity. If America could improve relations with China, it would make the Soviets terrified of a US-China alliance. This fear of being left out, Kissinger believed, would make the Soviets much friendlier towards the US themselves. Kissinger's plan was to break this circle of hostilities through secret diplomacy. With the help from Romania, which had a somewhat independent foreign policy, the Nixon administration set up back-channel talks with China. In July 1971, while on an official visit to Pakistan, Kissinger faked a stomach ache to skip public events. The press was informed that the Secretary of State was recovering in a mountain resort. In reality, he secretly flew to Beijing. Kissinger spent 48 hours in intense, secret talks with Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai. When the mission succeeded, he sent a one-word coded telegram to President Nixon: Eureka. Days later, Nixon shocked the world by announcing on live TV that he would be the first US president to visit China. This bold move was the heart of what Kissinger called triangular diplomacy. The idea was simple but brilliant. The US would have better relationships with both China and the Soviet Union than those two had with each other. The rule of three gave America a powerful advantage. By opening up to China, the US forced the Soviet Union to station over 40 divisions of troops on the Chinese border. This distracted the Red Army and reduced the threat they posed to Western Europe, all without spending a single dollar. In February 1972, Nixon arrived in China. From that moment on, the Cold War was no longer a simple us versus them struggle. It instead became a three-player game where the US held the winning hand. The US also made mistakes. There have been many times when America bullied smaller countries or toppled governments only to replace them with American puppets. But overall, smart diplomacy like Kissinger's opening to China shows how clever strategy can produce powerful results. When we think about power, most of us imagine something physical, like a huge army or a massive economy. Of course, those things matter, but in today's world, being a superpower isn't just about muscle or money. It's about influence you can't always see, the power to attract, inspire, and lead people because they want to follow you, not because they're forced to. To understand how a superpower functions, we must distinguish between two different ways of getting what you want in the world. First is hard power. This is the power of coercion. It uses sticks like military threats or economic sanctions and carrots, foreign aid, trade deals, to force or buy compliance. It is visible, direct, and very expensive to maintain. Soft power is the power of attraction. It arises from the beauty of a country's culture, the perceived justness of its values, and the way it acts on the world stage. When other countries admire your way of life, they start wanting the same things you want. For example, culture can act as a superpower's most effective diplomacy. When Hollywood films, American music, and Silicon Valley innovations penetrated every corner of the globe, they did more than entertain. By showing a lifestyle defined by freedom and opportunity, American movies seduced millions of people around the world. Many of them wanted to move and work in the US. This created a brain gain that fueled the superpower's economy far more effectively than any trade deal. One of the great mistakes a superpower can make is treating its allies like subordinates. Alliances like NATO worked so well because countries chose to be part of them, not because they're forced. Allies are crucial because they provide bases, intelligence, and resources, allowing the superpower to extend its reach without bearing the full burden alone. The prestige a country has is important. A superpower's word has to mean something. If a superpower is seen as the place that leads by example, its diplomats have an easier job. Other leaders trust their word and follow their lead. However, this prestige is fragile. Like after the Iraq invasion, when a superpower is perceived to have lied or acted hypocritically, its quiet glow begins to dim. Once credibility is eroded, the superpower must work twice as hard to get the same results. Friends become skeptics, and skeptics can over time become rivals. Without prestige, a superpower is forced to rely entirely on hard power. But, as I already mentioned, leading through hard power alone is too expensive to maintain over a long period of time. Not even the richest countries can afford it. During the Cold War, the world was basically a giant chessboard with two players, the US and the Soviet Union. Every move mattered because one wrong step could lead to nuclear disaster or losing a whole continent to Soviet influence. It is just like a competition between two athletes. The challenge of a powerful adversary tends to bring out the best in people and countries as well. The US state and its society, being challenged by the Soviets, put up a lot of effort to surpass the USSR in every way possible. Scientists raced to invent new technologies, economic measures were taken to outgrow the Soviets. The larger economy let the US invest more money in the armed forces, which were better equipped and trained than the Soviet army. The US also invested heavily in its diplomacy. To win, they had to understand the nuances of local cultures to prevent them from turning red. Experts study the Soviets because only by understanding your enemy's mentality can you anticipate its moves. The Soviets offered an alternative model, and the US had to prove its model was better. This forced the Americans to act smart. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the world became unipolar, completely dominated by the US. Political scientist Francis Fukuyama famously said that we had reached the end of history. He and many others believed that Western liberal democracy had won, and it was only a matter of time before the rest of the world followed suit. The phrase indispensable nation, popularized in the 90s, captured a new mood. If the US was the only nation that mattered, it didn't need to negotiate in the traditional sense. It only needed to inform others of its decisions. When you have the world's most powerful military and no one can fight back, the incentive to use slow, difficult diplomacy fades. You start using hard power because it's faster. Thus, the US did not feel the need to be as diplomatically shrewd. Instead of complex diplomacy, the US began to rely heavily on economic sanctions. Overusing them eventually pushed rivals and even some allies to look for ways to bypass the US dollar, weakening American power in the long run. So Trump's America First approach didn't appear out of nowhere. It's only the latest chapter in a long decline. Trump replaced strategic relationship-building diplomacy with a "what can I get right now" attitude. This is a form of lazy diplomacy that ignores the importance of alliances in favor of short-term wins. The unipolar moment is over, China is rising, offering countries a new club to join. The US can't continue to boss everyone around anymore. But instead of stepping up its diplomatic game, the current administration seems stuck in the same old hard power mindset. So here we are, in the first chaotic weeks of 2026, where the bold and aggressive moves of Trumpism are playing out in real time and not without consequences. On January 3rd, US Special Forces launched a midnight raid in Caracas, capturing Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro and his wife. They were flown to New York to face drug trafficking charges. The US called it a win against corruption and a way to tap into Venezuela's massive oil reserves. Reports say over 100 people died, including civilians. And here's the irony: only Maduro was removed, the rest of his regime stayed put. This wasn't about democracy or freedom, it was about control. Trump doesn't mind authoritarian regimes as long as they listen to America. Next, the spotlight shifted to Greenland, a mineral-rich Danish territory Trump has obsessed over for years. He doubled down on his demands, refusing to rule out force. When Denmark and NATO allies sent small reconnaissance teams to Greenland in support, Trump hit back with threats of steep tariffs, starting at 10% in February and rising to 25% by June, unless the US gets a complete and total purchase deal. Denmark's foreign minister called this a serious threat to NATO. Even some US senators warned it could fracture the alliance. This is the core problem with Trumpism, chasing quick wins while sacrificing long-term partnerships. Sure, the raid might score some immediate gains, oil access, resource leverage, political points, but the cost is huge. By bullying allies and smaller countries, the US risks isolation. Countries that once stood with America are now looking elsewhere. A perfect example happened just days ago. On January 16th, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney met with China's President Xi Jinping in Beijing, the first visit in nearly 10 years, and announced a new strategic partnership. Canada agreed to cut its 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles, allowing up to 49,000 imports a year at a much lower rate. China promised to open its market to more Canadian agricultural goods. Carney said relations with China are now more predictable than with the US, blaming Trump's tariffs, threats about Canada becoming the 51st state, and pressure over Greenland. This shows how US aggression is pushing allies toward China, the stable and trade-focused and non-aggressive alternative power. At the heart of this mess is a big misunderstanding. Trump hates trade deficits when other countries sell more to the US than vice versa, and calls them unfair. But he misses how much America benefits from the global system it built. The US dollar is the world's reserve currency, letting America borrow and spending big without crushing the economy. Other countries hold trillions in US assets, helping finance American lifestyles and military power. Trump takes this for granted, but his aggressive tactics, sanctions, threats unpredictable policies are shaking global trust in the dollar. The world is quietly moving away from it, and America's special advantage is sleeping. Trump also ignores the power of soft power, the kind of influence that comes from being admired and trusted, not feared. Instead, he relies on hard power, military raids, tariffs, and territorial demands. But hard power alone can't stand. It drains resources, breeds resentment, and creates a world that's turning against the US. History shows empires that rule by fear are often unstable and eventually collapse. The backlash is already happening. Allies are boosting their own defenses, rivals are exploiting cracks, and the dollar's dominance is weakening. By treating international relations like a zero-sum game, Trumpism risks turning America from the world's indispensable leader into an isolated outcast. In today's complex world, real strength isn't when everyone fears you, it's when everyone wants you as an ally. If this continues, America might soon learn a tough lesson. The alliances and systems that made it great can disappear faster than they were built. Will this wake-up call force a return to wiser diplomacy? Or has the damage already begun? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed my video, please give it a like and subscribe to my channel. I'll see you in the next video.